Hey everyone. So, this is going to be a different type of video than what I put out so far. I've had to deal with a lot more people lately within the debating community, especially newcomers. They either make or succumb to arguments that are so unbelievably asinine or regressive that it makes someone like me who's been around the community for years cringe hard. And my irritation for people falling for and making these arguments has gotten so high that I put other projects on hold to make the video you're watching now. So without further ado, let's get started. Also, for the record, this list isn't in any specific order, so number 1 isn't better or worse than number 2. And stuff that you think I probably should have mentioned in this video, I probably have planned for its own video. Number 1. Reality-Fiction Interaction Fallacy. This is simply when someone asserts that a fictional object is somehow interacting with the real world. This is obviously wrong because as we've seen living in the real world, fictional characters are, well, fictional, and do not interact with us that way. When seeing a fictional character interact with something that views them as fiction, the most likely assumption is that there is simply another realm that views that character's world as fiction, like the realms beyond the Overvoid in DC, or the audience in the 4D Goku film, etc. With the example of the latter, the people who go to see the movie don't actually fuse with Goku, but rather a fictional representation of them that doesn't have any inherent power granted to them just by them being representations of quote-unquote real things. With both of these things, we don't basically assume that any quote-unquote real things in fiction are things in our real world. Adopting ideas like this undermines how one would actually scale a versus cosmology, since it becomes less about the size of these structures and more about when or how these characters interact with metafictional structures. This leaves the verses that simply never have a metafictional element in their works to be weaker than verses that have had one, despite viewing something as fiction only granting another dimension of size. So for example, let's say there's a verse where people are very casually universal plus, so their attacks can interact with things with a fourth vector or dimensional axis, and we introduce a character who views them as fiction and we call him Ligma the author. Ligma viewing the verse as fiction and being a quote-unquote author doesn't grant him any power inherently, because he's not the real author, and as we know, the author is dead outside the text. Number 2. Keyword scaling. This next thing is one of the main reasons I decided to make this video, which is essentially attempting to reach a power scaling conclusion using various keywords instead of a firm understanding of the underlying reasons and concepts behind the scaling. An example I've seen being used in full effect involves arguing Saitama is in the boundless tier in regards to the versus Battle Wiki's tiering system, solely based on the statement that Saitama has boundless strength. Besides the fact that this argument being a blatant naming fallacy, it completely disregards the context in which the statement comes from. For those who don't read One Punch Man, the man making this statement is a scientist that created a being known as Garbage Kabuto, an incredibly powerful character that can arguably take on a ton of high tiers in the verse. And Saitama just came in and one-shot him. Now let's read that statement again with another similarly translated version of this same scene. In exchange for his boundless strength, he became bald. What's more, that very strength also brought him boundless alienation. It was written all over his face. In one blow, he utterly destroyed the strongest warrior we ever created. And now for the other translation. In exchange for his power, he became bald. And after annihilating the strongest being in the history of my research with a single blow, his expression told me of the overwhelming feeling of alienation the strength I'd given him. So given both these statements, it seems like even when given such little context to this one statement, it's not even saying anything about Saitama becoming an outer-versal character. And it's actually saying something about how Saitama, after he broke his limiter, he became extremely depressed. Another example would be when people look for the word Platonic in a fictional work and attempt to scale whatever object to Plato's theory of forms, independent of whether the thing in question is actually that strong or if it's even what a Platonic form would be. An example of this would be when people use this scan from Marvel that says Platonic War. Firstly, this would be a massive outlier for the Earths in Marvel. Secondly, the Earth itself is not this original model outside the mind that a Platonic form would actually be in reality. And finally, the term Platonic War doesn't even make sense in this context. Contrast this with DC's scan of the new gods being Platonic forms, and not only in this scan do we get a description of what a Platonic bullet would be, but beyond that, the God Sphere in general has buttloads of evidence supporting it being outer-versal without this scan. Not that there's anything wrong with it using this scan, but the point of the God Sphere being outer-versal can stand completely on its own without this argument. Number 3. Ramifications of what you're arguing. Number 3 leads on from number 2 in the sense that people who argue stuff like Universal Earths and Marvel don't understand the ramifications of what they're arguing. The ramifications of what they're arguing being the effects it has on the overall consistency. For example, let's say any random character in Marvel scales to destroying the Earth. Are they just universal now? What about the characters who obviously scale to them, and the non-powered characters who aren't dwarfed like bacteria? What about them? You end up attempting to justify this extreme position with one scan, not realizing that that one scan is the only thing that's proving your point, and that there's already a much more consistent interpretation out there that can explain the non-powered characters and the powered characters just fine. In contrast, an argument that's ramifications are positive would be the story of Superman. With the story of Superman interpretation, we can explain high-end feats like him punching the World Forger, or him fighting the conceptual embodiment of his own death. With these feats having him being Ant per se, it makes post-crisis and rebirth Superman much more consistent. For example, let's say we don't use the story of Superman interpretation. Well, now these high-end feats need to be explained somehow. The only option that's an actual explanation would be that this is how strong Superman is when he's not holding back. Well, now Doomsday is either that strong too, or Superman is also massively holding back again. And if we scale off of Doomsday, I'm sure you can see where this is going. With this hypothetical of getting rid of the story of Superman, we've made a total mess of the consistency that Superman had before the story of Superman interpretation. The people who tend to argue positions like this, where they really don't understand what comes from what they're arguing, then will sometimes realize that they're wrong but refuse to admit it, which leads into the next point. Number 4. Idiot's advocate. Although we use a different word instead of idiot that starts with an R, it would obviously get my video demonetized, so there you go. Idiot's advocate is essentially the act of taking a position that you know is wrong, and instead of admitting that it's wrong and conceding, you hold it out of pride. In other words, this is a term we often use to describe overly prideful debaters, that even when we're faced with the reality that they're not at all winning the argument, they press on because they rather continue fighting a losing battle than admit defeat, which in my opinion kind of defeats the point of debating somebody, and ironically I believe a lot of people within the debating community don't understand what a debate even is. A debate, or a dialectic, is a discussion between two opposing viewpoints where the point is to come to a consensus from these two viewpoints. Whether or not it is a formal discussion, or if you vocalized your intent to engage in said debate, is irrelevant. If you disagree with that person, and or have an imposing stance on the issue, and then you then engage into a discussion, you're engaging in a dialectical debate. Now, when you are debating someone, your goal in said discussion is usually to prove your position to be more valid than the opposing position that you're debating against. And whatever position ends up holding more validity, or remains the most logically consistent, would be deemed the winner of said debate. Now, those who unknowingly hold idiot's advocate don't ultimately care about expanding their knowledge or trying to find out whether they're right or wrong. They just care about winning the debate for either clout or to ensure their social status remains high. And when you have been doing that for a long time, or that's kind of what you're known for, losing any debate would be seen as pretty detrimental to you. Because if you're just debating someone just to prove a point, you're not ultimately trying to better yourself. You're either trying to embarrass the other person or to make yourself look good. So when you're losing really badly, your pride is on the line, and conceding would only make you look like a coward in the eyes of yourself and your diehard fans. So in response to that, anime protagonist syndrome kicks in, and you continue to press on even when there's no hope in making a comeback. But the problem with that is, now you just look like a massive idiot, because unfortunately the rules of anime don't always apply to real life, less so in a debate. Pressing on in a losing battle doesn't make you any stronger, it just makes you look like a moron. So what advice do I have to you as a viewer or someone who does this exact thing in debates? Easy. Drop the egos. Focus on trying to better yourself whenever you're debating someone instead of solely doing it to boost your social status within a community. Because even then, if you lose a debate, you've gained two things in the end than those who hold idiot's advocate. Good experience and a better understanding of how to power scale and or debate. Coming to a consensus, i.e. finishing a debate, is way better than doing something we call memeing out, which is to pretend that the whole debate, despite how serious the person may have been, was all a meme and not serious. So you totally didn't debunk their arguments, which is really what matters in the debate is the arguments, and memeing out completely sidesteps the purpose of the debate. Number 5. Using a character's title or rank. This stance comes from verses that have an established hierarchy or organization with characters who are, say, A-class or captains. people will blindly assume that all the captains or class of characters are the same strength and are stronger than the lower group of characters in spite of feats. For an obvious example as to why we don't randomly assume this, look at Naruto, both the series and the character. Until very late into part 2, he was a Genin. Does that mean that all Genin are as strong as him? What about Kakashi, who's above Naruto in rank, be it Kage or him as a Jonin? Is he then stronger than Naruto too, despite the feats? This mistake or dogma in power scaling is basically assuming the characters or the fictional organization is more credible than the point of view we have in the story. For example, if we take these ranks as absolute, then Private Bill is weaker than Sergeant Bob, even if Sergeant Bob can only destroy door, and Bill is destroying stars. With that example, we now have to assume that either A, Bob just magically scales off of anything Bill does, or B, assume our point of view in the story is just wrong for some reason, even though we aren't seeing things through a character's perspective. Now, this isn't to say a verse cannot have ranks that are tied to strength, but rather we shouldn't assume rank always equals strength, especially when feats contradict it. As Sun Tzu said in The Art of War, if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 1,000 battles. Or as G.I. Joe once said, knowing is half the battle. To become better at fictional analysis is to know what you're reading and knowing the pitfalls of dogmatic interpretations and how to avoid them. Our job as readers of a piece of text is to interpret the text with some interpretations being more consistent and less dogmatic than others. For the most part, people who have actually read what they're talking about will usually be able to come to a better interpretation than the secondaries who don't read the source material, but that may be a video for another time. Well, anyway, that's it for the video. Like and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. Thank you all for watching, and class is dismissed.